An FD 302 is not just paperwork. It is the official FBI record of a witness interview, every statement, every detail, every reference preserved as part of a federal case. Prosecutors rely on it. You do not misplace an FD 302, and you do not omit it casually. When it disappears, it does not become invisible, it becomes evidence of something else, intent, obstruction, or manipulation. Now keep that in mind, because everything that follows depends on it. The witness at the center of this case was interviewed 4 times over nearly 3 years. The first interview, in 2019, was broad and general, describing Jeffrey Epstein's operations without naming specific individuals or locations. That interview was released publicly, creating the appearance of transparency. But 6 weeks later, a second interview was conducted, this time more focused, asking about specific people and places. That interview is not in the public record. 3 months later, a third interview took place with a different set of agents. That one is also missing. Then, 11 months later, a fourth interview occurred, and this time a senior FBI official was present, something not routine, but reserved for moments when the testimony had become more significant. That interview is missing as well. So out of 4 interviews, only 1 was released. 3 were removed. However, all 4 interviews are documented in the Maxwell Trial Discovery Log, a court-supervised record that cannot be altered. That log lists 15 documents related to this witness. But when you check the Department of Justice public database, you only find 7. 8 records are missing, not pending, not delayed, gone. This discrepancy became critical during a hearing, where Jamie Raskin walked in with a document comparing both realities side by side. On one side, the Department of Justice public release. On the other, the Maxwell Trial Discovery Log. 15 versus 7. 8 missing. At that moment, the issue shifted, from oversight to potential legal liability. The timeline makes it even more serious. On January 14, the Department of Justice initiated a targeted classification review of Epstein-related interviews involving senior officials. This was not random, it had a clear scope and a strict deadline. Complete the review before the public release on January 28. The release happened on January 28, but the 3 FD 302 reports were not included. By February 11, when Pam Bondi testified under oath, those documents had already been removed from the public database. So when she clearly stated that there was no evidence that Donald Trump had committed a crime, that statement came after key records had already been excluded. That is the turning point. Because if those documents had remained, the wording of that statement would have changed. The certainty would have disappeared, and qualifications would have been unavoidable. Then the pressure increased. During the hearing, Thomas Massie did not ask who ordered the removal. He asked a more precise question: when were you informed? That question assumes knowledge. It does not allow for ignorance. Pam Bondi did not deny awareness. Instead, she responded that classification decisions are handled through appropriate internal channels. That is not a denial, it is a confirmation wrapped in process language. And in that moment, the structure became clear. 3 FBI interviews, referencing specific individuals and locations, were removed from public access before sworn testimony declared no evidence existed. A classification review was initiated, a public release excluded key records, and a statement under oath relied on their absence. This is not about politics. This is about whether a system built on evidence can remove that evidence before the public ever has the chance to see it. Think about it in simple terms. If someone removes pages from a file before handing it to you, and then asks you to make a statement based on what remains, is your statement complete, or is it shaped by what you were not allowed to see? Now apply that logic to sworn testimony before a congressional committee. This is where the real issue lies, not in what was said, but in what was made impossible to say. Those missing records do not belong to an agency. They belong to the public. And when the gap between what exists and what is shown becomes visible, it stops being a discrepancy and starts becoming a question with consequences. So here is the question. If evidence can be removed before testimony, and testimony then relies on that absence, what exactly is that oath attached to? And if that question makes you uncomfortable, then you already understand what is at stake. The room did not go silent in the ordinary sense. It was not empty, it was heavy. The kind of stillness that appears when everyone knows the next sentence will define everything that came before it. Pam Bondi's hand stayed flat on the table, fingers spread, controlled, deliberate. That is not the posture of someone searching for an answer. That is the posture of someone calculating exposure. Her jaw was set, eyes fixed forward. No glance at counsel, no movement toward the binder she had relied on all afternoon. Because in that moment, the binder could not help her. The answer was not in her notes. It was already locked inside the timeline. Thomas Massey did not interrupt. He did not repeat the question. He let the silence apply pressure. And in a hearing room like that, silence is not passive, it is force. When Pam Bondi finally spoke, she did not answer the question. She did not say when she had been informed about the January 14th classification review. Instead, she said decisions were made through appropriate internal channels. That distinction matters. Appropriate channels is not a date. It is not a denial. It is a shield, language that acknowledges process without revealing position inside that process. Now place that answer back into the timeline. January 14th, expedited classification review begins. January 28th, public release is executed. February 11th, sworn testimony is delivered. At no point does Pam Bondi say she was unaware. At no point does she place herself outside that sequence. Instead, she confirms the process existed, and that it followed what she calls appropriate channels. Jamie Raskin does not argue. He does something more precise. He describes the result of those channels. 3 FBI witness interviews, documented in a federal court record, referencing a senior official at a specific location, were removed from the public database, before sworn testimony declared that no evidence existed. He does not accuse. He aligns the timeline with the statement, and lets the contradiction speak for itself. At that moment, the hearing shifts. It is no longer performance, it becomes structured cross-examination. Because once the timeline is fixed, every answer is measured against documented facts. The FD 302 reports are not hypothetical. They are logged in the Maxwell trial discovery record, court-supervised, verified, permanent. They cannot be erased from that record. So when the Department of Justice releases only 7 out of 15 documents, it is not creating a record, it is presenting a filtered version of one. And when that version is labeled complete, that word itself becomes evidence. Because completeness here is not opinion, it is arithmetic. 15 versus 7 is not interpretation, it is fact. Now add the January 14th directive back into the equation. It ordered an expedited review of Epstein-related interviews involving senior officials, with a deadline before public release. That is not passive, it is active selection. It defines scope, sets timing, and requires completion before disclosure. Which means the January 28th release was not raw data, it was the result of that selection. And the 3 missing FD 302 reports fall directly within that scope. Follow the logic step by step. If those interviews were identified during the review, they were known. If they were known and not released, they were excluded. If they were excluded before February 11th, they were absent during testimony. And if they were absent because of that process, then the statement "no evidence exists" was made in a context where evidence had already been removed. That is not an accusation. That is a sequence. And sequences like this demand specificity, not general statements about process. That is why Thomas Massey's question matters. Not because of what it asked, but because of what it forced into the open. The question was simple. When were you informed? Because knowledge defines responsibility. And responsibility determines whether testimony reflects the full truth. Pam Bondi gave no date. No moment. She stayed inside process language. Now notice what she did not say. She did not say the FD 302 reports were irrelevant. She did not say they were inaccurate. She did not say they were withheld for national security. She did not address them at all. And in this context, silence is not neutral, it is directional. The entire hearing was built on the claim that Epstein-related files had been released without interference. That was the premise. But the moment those two columns appeared, 15 documents in court, 7 in public, that premise collapsed. 8 records missing. 3 of them critical FBI interview reports. That is not a formatting issue. That is not a delay. That is a gap that demands explanation. Then the pressure expands beyond the room. After Jamie Raskin's questioning, a formal written request is submitted. Not a verbal follow-up, a documented demand. It asks for the full work product of the January 14th review. Every page. Every decision. Every signature. That request starts a clock. 14 days. 14 days for the Department of Justice to explain how those 8 records were handled. 14 days to justify the removal. The deadline passes. No full documentation is provided. And that absence connects with everything before it: the missing reports, the expedited review, the filtered release, the sworn testimony. Because if the process was truly appropriate, as Pam Bondi stated, then the documentation should confirm it. If the documentation is missing, the explanation remains incomplete. Then another layer is added. Ted Lieu enters, not with a speech, but with a written question placed into the record. He identifies a critical legal distinction. The January 14th directive does not say public interest review. It says expedited assessment. Those are not the same. A public interest review weighs transparency against risk. An expedited assessment prioritizes speed and categorization. And in legal terms, that difference matters. Because the authority to remove or withhold documents before public release is not unlimited. It is defined by law, precedent, and the scope of the review itself. So Ted Lieu's question is direct. What legal authority allows an expedited assessment to remove court-verified evidence before disclosure? The question is simple, but sharp. What legal authority allows evidence to be removed entirely before it is ever released to the public? Not classified after release. Not redacted within the release. Removed completely. That question was entered into the official record. No response was provided. Now step back and look at the structure that has formed. A court record confirms 15 documents exist. A public database shows only 7. An internal directive reviews those documents before release. A sworn statement relies on their absence. A formal request for explanation receives no full answer. At this point, the issue is no longer whether the documents exist. That has already been proven. The issue is whether the system handling those documents operated within the boundaries it claims to uphold. And that is not just procedure, it is trust. Because if the public record can be shaped before it is seen, then every statement built on that record carries the weight of that shaping. And if that shaping is hidden, then the public is not evaluating evidence, they are evaluating a version of it. So now the question becomes sharper. Did the removal of those documents change what could be said under oath? Because if it did, then this is not a discrepancy, it is a structure. And a structure implies intent. Now the focus tightens even further. What did Pam Bondi know at the moment she said there was no evidence? And more importantly, what had already been removed before she said it? Because perjury is not about tone. It is not about politics. It is defined as a false statement, made knowingly, on a material matter, under oath. And the material matter here is clear: whether evidence existed. The FD 302 reports are not minor documents. They are primary evidence, recorded witness statements, preserved in a federal case, locked into a court record that cannot be altered. So follow the sequence again. The reports existed. They were identified during review. They were removed before public release. They were absent during testimony. Now only one variable remains: knowledge. Did Pam Bondi know those documents existed when she made that statement? Because if she did, then the statement is no longer incomplete, it becomes something else. That is why Thomas Mass's question matters so much. When were you informed? Because that answer determines everything. If she knew before January 28th, she knew before the public release. If she knew before February 11th, she knew before her testimony. If she knew after January 14th, she knew during the review process itself. But she gave no date. She did not place herself anywhere on that timeline. She remained inside the phrase appropriate channels, a phrase that confirms process but hides position. And in a timeline this tight, every missing detail becomes part of the evidence. Now consider what was inside those missing reports. The witness statements became more specific over time. They named a location, Mar-a-Lago. Not a vague reference, but a physical place tied to a senior public figure at the time. These details were not mentioned once, they appeared across multiple interviews, each one adding clarity, each one documented in an FD 302. The third and fourth interviews matter the most. Different agents. A senior official present. Increased scrutiny. That level of escalation does not happen for routine testimony. It happens when the content crosses a threshold of significance. And those are the reports that were removed. Think about that in simple terms. A witness provides information. That information becomes more detailed. The FBI increases attention. And then those records are excluded from what the public sees. At the same time, a statement is made under oath that no evidence exists. That is not coincidence. That is a sequence. And it aligns too precisely to ignore. This is where the issue becomes uncomfortable, because it forces a distinction. The difference between what exists in the system and what is allowed to be seen. The Maxwell trial record did not change. The court did not remove anything. Only the public-facing version changed. Which means the system did not lose the evidence, it controlled its visibility. And once you understand that, everything else becomes clearer. The January 14th directive was not about discovering unknown information. It was about identifying known material, specifically, Epstein-related interviews involving senior officials. The review found those documents. Then it decided what to include. That decision is the turning point. Because everything after it flows from that choice. A curated public release. A hearing based on assumed completeness. A statement under oath. And only when Jamie Raskin places the two records side by side, court record vs public database, does the structure begin to collapse. He did not uncover new evidence. He simply aligned two existing realities. 15 documents. 7 released. 8 missing. Once those numbers were visible, the contradiction was no longer theoretical, it was undeniable. Now bring it back to the legal threshold. Perjury requires 3 elements. A false statement. A material fact. Knowledge at the time. Materiality is clear. The existence of evidence in a major investigation is unquestionably relevant. Falsity depends on whether no evidence exists can stand against the FD 302 reports. And knowledge depends on where Pam Bondi stood on that timeline. The hearing did not answer that question. It exposed it. And exposure is not proof, but it is the step that makes proof possible. Because once the timeline is clear, once the documents are identified, once the gaps are measured, the next step is not speculation. It is retrieval. The full work product of the January 14th review, every page, every decision, every signature, that is where the answers are. And that is why its absence matters as much as the missing FD 302 reports themselves. Because without it, the system is asking the public to accept the result, without seeing the process. And that is where the real line is drawn. This is not about one person. It is not about one statement. It is about whether the system that controls evidence remains transparent when it matters most. Because if evidence can be shaped before testimony, then testimony itself becomes conditional. Conditional on what remains. Conditional on what was removed. And once testimony becomes conditional, the oath attached to it begins to lose its meaning. At this point, the question is no longer abstract. It is not rhetorical, it is procedural. Will those 3 FD 302 reports be produced? Because until they are, every statement made in that hearing exists under a shadow. Not a misunderstanding. Not a delay. A timeline. January 14th. January 28th. February 11th. And at every stage of that sequence, 3 documents are missing. That is not oversight. That is a pattern. And patterns do not resolve themselves. They are either explained or exposed. What happened in that hearing did not explain the pattern. It clarified it. It sharpened it. And it placed it into the congressional record, where it cannot be ignored, edited, or quietly erased. Because once a sequence like this is documented, it stops being a moment. It becomes a reference point. 14 days. That was the window given to the Department of Justice to produce the full work product of the January 14th review. 14 days to explain how those 8 missing records were handled. 14 days to prove that what Pam Bondi called appropriate channels could withstand scrutiny. The window closed. No full production. No complete explanation. No alignment between process and outcome. And when a system is given the chance to explain a documented gap, and does not, that absence becomes part of the record. Because in this context, silence is not neutral. It is cumulative. Now step back and look at what remains. A court record still showing 15 verified FBI documents. A public database still showing 7. 8 records missing. 3 of them, FD 302 reports documenting direct witness statements. A classification review on January 14th targeting exactly that category. A public release on January 28th excluding those records. A sworn statement on February 11th declaring no evidence exists. A question from Thomas Massey establishing awareness, without a timeline. A written challenge from Ted Lieu, without a response. A formal request for documents, without full production. That is not one gap. That is a chain. And chains like that are not broken by general statements. They are broken by specifics, specific dates, specific decisions, specific names tied to specific authorizations. Because at the center of this is not just missing documents. It is the authorization behind their removal. The January 14th directive carries a signature. A senior Department of Justice official. The authority is visible. What is missing is the reasoning. Why those documents? Why that timing? Why remove them before public release? These are not abstract questions. They are procedural, and they carry legal consequences. Now return to the statement that started everything. No evidence exists. 4 words. Delivered under oath. Clear. Unqualified. But those words no longer stand alone. They now exist inside a structure. A structure of missing records, defined timelines, unanswered requests, and a documented classification process that came before the statement itself. And once a statement is placed inside that structure, its meaning changes. Because the question is no longer whether those words were spoken. The question is whether they reflected the full reality at the time. That is the real threshold. Not intention. Not interpretation. Alignment. Does the statement align with what was known? If it does not, then the issue is no longer communication. It is accuracy under oath. Now step back even further. Because this is bigger than one hearing. Bigger than one name. If a classification process can identify evidence, remove it before public release, and that removal is not disclosed during testimony, then the system is no longer just managing information. It is shaping the conditions under which truth is evaluated. That is the difference between transparency and control. Transparency shows the full record. Control decides what you are allowed to see. And when control operates without disclosure, it does not just affect one case, it affects trust in every statement built on that record. Because the public is no longer evaluating evidence. They are evaluating a version of it. And that is the line that matters. Not political. Not strategic. Structural. Does the system present the full record when it speaks under oath? Or does it present a curated version, and call it complete? Because if it is the second, then the oath itself begins to lose meaning. Now the final question is not about what happened in that room. That is already documented. The real question is, what happens next? Will the full January 14th review be released? Will the 3 missing FD 302 reports be made public? Will the timeline finally be completed with answers? Or will the gaps remain? Because if the gaps remain, then the pattern remains. And if the pattern remains, then every future statement tied to this sequence carries that same unresolved weight. 15 documents. 7 released. 8 missing. 4 interviews. 1 public, 3 removed. Those numbers do not change. Only one thing can change: whether they are explained. So ask yourself this. If evidence can be identified, removed, and never shown before testimony is given, what exactly is the public being asked to trust? And if the answer is unclear, then the problem is not what you are missing. It is what you were never allowed to see.